The university was known for its tall buildings, wide hallways, and the proud traditions of excellence. Students walked quickly across the campus, holding books and laptops, rushing to their classes. Among the many classrooms, one lecture hall always stood out because of the man who taught there. He was a calculus professor, highly educated, and very proud of his knowledge. His students admired his skills in mathematics, but they also whispered about something else: his arrogance. The professor believed he was the smartest person in the entire building. Every time he spoke with authority, and he enjoyed reminding others of their mistakes. When a student gave the wrong answer, he would not just correct them. He would do it in a way that made the whole class laugh at their error. 2. It was not enough to be right. He wanted everyone else to feel small while he looked superior. His lectures were filled with complicated formulas, and he loved to show how quickly he could solve them. The chalk moved fast in his hand, and students struggled to keep up. While many professors tried to encourage students, he did the opposite. If someone could not follow his explanation, he would raise an eyebrow and say things like, "Maybe you should think about another major." Some students feared asking questions, worried that they would become the next target of his sharp tongue. On one particular day, the professor was in an unusually proud mood. He had just published a paper and bragged about it before class began. He looked around the lecture hall as if he owned the place. As he was preparing to start, he noticed someone quietly walking into the room. It was the janitor, a middle-aged black woman named Ms. Daniels, carrying her cleaning supplies. She had a gentle face, her eyes focused on her work, and she moved quietly to avoid disturbing anyone. She came every day to tidy up the lecture hall, sweep the floor, and empty the trash bins. The professor looked at her for a moment, and instead of showing respect, he smirked. To him, the sight of a janitor in his classroom while he was about to explain advanced calculus felt like a contrast he could not ignore. He leaned on the desk and said, in a voice loud enough for the students to hear, "Some people belong in the world of numbers, and others, well, they belong in the world of mops." The room went silent for a second. A few students let out nervous laughs, unsure whether to agree or stay quiet. The professor's face showed satisfaction, as if he had made a clever joke. He turned back to the board, ready to continue without giving Ms. Daniels a second thought. But what he didn't notice was the look in her eyes. She didn't react with anger or embarrassment. Instead, she looked calm, almost as if his words could not touch her. She had heard such things before in her life, and she had learned how to carry herself with quiet dignity. She kept sweeping, moving her broom softly across the floor while the professor continued with his lecture. Students shifted in their seats. Some of them felt uneasy. They had seen the professor's arrogance before, but targeting the janitor felt different. She was not a student competing with him in knowledge. She was just doing her job. Yet, the professor seemed to enjoy using her presence as another way to display his pride. As the chalk scratched across the board, the professor's voice filled the room. He was explaining a complicated problem, one that only a few students could follow. His tone was sharp, his sentences fast. But while he felt powerful in that moment, there was something he could not see. He could not see that behind the quiet, ordinary appearance of Ms. Daniels lived a brilliant mind. He could not imagine that the woman he just mocked had once studied advanced mathematics herself, or that she carried with her a deep love for numbers that life had interrupted but never erased. The professor's arrogance blinded him. He saw only her uniform, her cleaning cart, and her quiet steps. To him, she was invisible, except as a prop for his pride. He returned to solving equations on the board, certain that he was teaching in a room where no one could ever challenge him. And yet, the students who had witnessed his remark carried the memory of it. The little smirk, the cruel words, the way Ms. Daniels continued, sweeping with quiet strength that stayed in their minds. None of them could guess that soon the balance of power in that room would shift in a way the professor never expected. The arrogance that seemed so unshakable in that moment would soon face its greatest test. The man who believed he was the smartest in the building was about to meet someone he never imagined could stand beside him in knowledge, someone he had dismissed without a second thought. Asterisk the next week. The lecture hall was once again full of students. Some sat in the front row, eager to prove themselves, while others lingered in the back, half listening, half distracted. The professor entered the room with his usual confident stride, holding a stack of notes that he didn't really need. He liked the attention, the way the entire room seemed to wait for his words. To him, teaching wasn't about helping students, it was about showing off his intelligence. He began his lecture with a complicated problem, filling the board with numbers and symbols. His chalk clicked sharply against the surface, echoing through the silent hall. Students bent their heads, trying to copy what he wrote, but many of them struggled. The professor paused for a moment, glanced at the class, and asked, "Does anyone here know the next step?" A hand went up nervously. A young student tried to give an answer, but the professor cut him off quickly. No, that's not even close," he said, his voice filled with impatience. A ripple of laughter spread through the class. The professor smiled, pleased with himself. Humiliating students had become part of his daily routine as the lesson continued. The door at the back of the lecture hall creaked open. Ms. Daniels, the janitor, quietly stepped inside. She carried her cleaning cart as usual, moving toward the far side of the room where the trash bins stood. She didn't look at the professor or the students. She simply did her work, careful not to disturb the lecture. But the professor noticed her. His eyes narrowed slightly. He remembered her. From the previous week, the same woman he had mocked with his cruel joke about mops and numbers. Instead of ignoring her this time, he decided to make her presence a tool for his arrogance once again. He stopped writing and leaned against the desk, folding his arms. With a smirk, he looked directly at her and said loudly, "You know, class, some people spend their whole lives around math and never understand it. And some people," he tilted his head toward Ms. Daniels, "shouldn't even try." The room went very still. Students exchanged awkward glances. A few looked down at their notebooks, pretending not to hear. Others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but too afraid to speak up. The professor's words weren't just rude, they carried a sting of cruelty. Ms. Daniels froze for a moment, her hands still holding the trash bag she was about to replace. She slowly looked up, her eyes meeting his. She didn't say a word. Her face stayed calm, her expression unreadable. She had dealt with disrespect before far worse than the sand she had learned long ago not to give satisfaction to people who tried to belittle her. With quiet grace, she continued her work, moving the trash bag out of the bin and tying it neatly. The professor chuckled under his breath, as if he had won some invisible battle. "See, no response," he told the class. "Even she knows it's true." His words hung in the air like smoke, but something unexpected happened. One of the students sitting near the front shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at the professor, then at Ms. Daniels, and for the first time, he felt a wave of shame, not for her, but for the man standing at the board. The arrogance that had once seemed impressive now looked mean-spirited. Still, no one spoke. The authority of the professor was too strong, and his reputation made students hesitate. No one wanted to be the next person he mocked. And so the silence stretched on, filled only by the sound of Ms. Daniels' broom sweeping softly against the floor. What the professor didn't know, and what the students didn't yet realize, was that Ms. Daniels carried with her a mind sharper than anyone in the room could imagine. She had studied mathematics when she was younger, before life forced her onto another path. She had once dreamed of solving problems just like the ones on that chalkboard. Even though she never earned the chance to finish her studies, her passion for numbers never died. Every formula, every equation she saw reignited that quiet flame within her as she finished her work and prepared to leave the room. She glanced at the board. Her eyes scanned the complicated formula, the half-completed solution, the symbols that looked impossible to most students. For her, they were not impossible. They were familiar, almost comforting. But she stayed quiet, carrying her trash bag. Out the door, leaving behind only the soft echo of her footsteps. The professor returned to his lecture, acting as though nothing significant had happened. He raised his voice again, explaining how brilliant his solution was, using words that confused most of his students. He basked in his own pride, blind to the fact that his arrogance was slowly building a storm he would soon have to face. And somewhere deep inside, Ms. Daniels felt something stir. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was resolve. She knew she didn't need to respond to his insult with words. Life had taught her that the best response to disrespect wasn't shouting or fighting, was showing the truth when the right time came. And that time, though no one could see it yet, was coming closer every day. Asterisk, a few days later, the lecture hall was quiet. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, lighting up the chalkboard that was still covered with half-erased equations. The students had just finished a grueling calculus session, and many had left feeling defeated. The professor had given them a problem so complex that not a single hand went up to attempt it. He enjoyed watching their frustration. To him, it proved his superiority. "I'll leave this one for you to think about," he had said smugly before. Walking out, certain that none of them could solve it. The chalkboard now stood like a silent challenge. Its symbols twisted and tangled in ways that made the problem seem impossible. Later that afternoon, Ms. Daniels entered the room with her cart, as she always did. The hall was empty now. No voices, no laughter, no sharp remarks from the professor. Just silence. She liked these moments when she could work in peace. She moved quietly, sweeping the floor and straightening chairs, her mind wandering. As she reached the front of the room, her eyes landed on the chalkboard. At first, she looked at it the way anyone might, just lines of symbols and numbers left behind after a class. But then, something pulled her closer. She set down her broom and walked up to the board. The equations stirred something deep inside her, a memory of another life. Years ago, she had sat in classrooms much like this one, not as a janitor, but as a student. She had loved mathematics, the logic, the beauty, the way everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Life had interrupted her studies, pulling her away before she could finish her degree. But the love of math never left her. Even now, after long work days of cleaning, she sometimes read old math books at home, scribbling solutions in notebooks no one else ever saw. She looked at the professor's unfinished problem. Her eyes scanned the symbols, and slowly, her mind began to work. To others, the problem looked impossible, but to her, it was like hearing the faint notes of a song she once knew by heart. She picked up a piece of chalk. For a moment, she hesitated. What if someone walked in? What if the professor found out? But then, a quiet determination filled her. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She wasn't doing it to prove anything. She was doing it because she loved it. Her hand moved across the board, steady and confident. Step by step, she broke the problem down, each line of chalk bringing clarity where there had been confusion. She filled in missing parts, corrected the professor's careless skips, and moved forward with precision. The more she worked, the more alive she felt. Numbers and symbols flowed naturally, as if her mind had been waiting for this moment for years. By the time she finished, The board was transformed. What had once been a messy, incomplete equation was now a clean, perfect solution. She stepped back, breathing lightly, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of pride, but of quiet joy. She had touched a part of herself that she thought she had lost. At that very moment, a student walked into the hall. He had forgotten his notebook and came back to retrieve it. But when he entered, he froze. There, in front of the board, stood Ms. Daniels, the janitor, chalk in hand. His eyes widened as he saw the complete solution spread across the chalkboard. He knew the problem. Everyone in class knew it. The professor had said it was one of the most difficult equations, something that none of them could solve. Yet here, it was solved, and solved beautifully. The student didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, stunned. Ms. Daniels noticed him, and her cheeks flushed slightly. She put the chalk down and picked up her broom again, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Forgot something?" she asked kindly. The student nodded quickly, grabbed his notebook, and hurried out. But his mind was racing. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. The janitor, someone the professor had openly mocked, had solved a problem the entire class had failed to answer. As Ms. Daniels continued her cleaning, she thought nothing more of it. To her, it was just a moment of joy. A small spark of curiosity and passion that she carried quietly. But to that student, it was something far bigger. He now held a secret one that challenged everything he thought he knew about his arrogant professor and the woman most people overlooked. He left the building with his notebook in hand, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if anyone would believe him, but he knew one thing for certain. The janitor wasn't who she seemed. She was something more. And slowly, word began to spread. The next morning, campus life moved as usual. Students filled the hallways carrying books and coffee cups, hurrying to their lectures. But among the chatter and footsteps, a new story began to ripple quietly through the corridors. It started small, like a whisper, and then slowly grew louder. It came from the boy who had walked back into the lecture hall the day before. He had not been able to sleep that night. The image of Ms. Daniels at the board stayed with him. He kept seeing her calm face, the chalk in her hand, and the impossible equation solved perfectly from start to finish. The more he thought about it, the more extraordinary it seemed. How could a janitor solve a problem that left an entire class, and even the professor himself, stuck? At breakfast in the cafeteria, he leaned across the table to his friends and whispered, "You won't believe what I saw yesterday." His friends laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, but when he described the scene, her quiet movements, the flawless solution, they stopped smiling. "Wait, are you serious?" one of them asked, eyes wide. He nodded. "Dead serious. She solved it like it was nothing. I'm telling you, she's a math genius." By the afternoon, the story had already traveled beyond his small group. Students who hadn't even been in the same class were now repeating it. "Did you hear about the janitor? They say she solved a problem the professor couldn't." Some rolled their eyes and dismissed it as nonsense. Others laughed, saying it was just a rumor. But a few leaned in, curious, wanting to know more. In the library, a group of students whispered about it between stacks of books. "Maybe she studied math before," one said. "Or maybe it's just a made-up story to make the professor look bad." But deep down, part of them wanted it to be true. The idea of a quiet, overlooked janitor secretly being a mathematical genius was too powerful to ignore. Even the professors in nearby departments caught wind of the rumor. Over lunch in the faculty lounge, one asked another, "Have you heard this nonsense about a janitor solving an advanced calculus problem?" The others chuckled, shaking their heads. To them, it sounded ridiculous, almost like a fairy tale. "Students will believe anything these days," one said, but not everyone dismissed it. A few of the more thoughtful students began to wonder. They remembered how often Ms. Daniels walked through classrooms, how she always paused for a second at the chalkboard, as though studying it. Could it be possible that behind her quiet eyes, she carried a mind sharper than anyone realized? Meanwhile, Ms. Daniels herself had no idea the story was spreading. She went about her work as usual, sweeping hallways, mopping floors, emptying bins. She greeted people with the same warm smile, unaware that whispers now followed her. But the one person who refused to believe any of it was the calculus professor. When a student nervously mentioned the rumor after class, he laughed loudly, his voice dripping with scorn. "Ridiculous," he said. "Utterly ridiculous. Do you honestly think someone with no education could do what I do? She doesn't even belong in this lecture hall." He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, but inside, something unsettled him. He told himself, it was impossible. A janitor solving his equations. Absurd. And yet, the persistence of the rumor annoyed him. Every time he walked into the classroom, he noticed the way students looked at Ms. Daniels when she came in to clean. There was a new kind of respect in their eyes, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, he didn't like it. One afternoon, as he erased the board after a lecture, he caught sight of Ms. Daniels entering quietly, broom in hand. For a split second, he wondered, had she really done it? No. He quickly pushed the thought away. To him, she was a symbol of what he thought was lesser, someone beneath his world of academia. He couldn't allow himself to imagine she might actually be capable of more. But the students weren't so sure. A small group began to linger after lectures, hoping to catch her glancing at the board again. They whispered among themselves, trying to decide if they should ask her directly. One bold student even thought about handing her a math book just to see her reaction. The whispers grew stronger each day, weaving themselves into the life of the campus. And though Ms. Daniels continued to sweep the floors with quiet dignity, a storm was quietly forming. Around her, a story of hidden brilliance had taken root, and no amount of denial from the professor could stop it. It was only a matter of time before the rumor would turn into a challenge. And when that moment came, the truth long hidden beneath uniforms, mops, and years of silence would finally come to light. The rumor had become impossible to ignore. By now, nearly everyone on campus had heard at least a whisper of the story. The janitor who had solved the impossible problem. Some still laughed it off. Others were secretly fascinated, and a few believed it wholeheartedly. For the students, it was exciting. For the professor, it was humiliating. He couldn't stand the way his students sometimes looked at him when Ms. Daniels entered the room. He noticed their quick glances, the way conversations quieted when she passed by. It made his skin crawl. How dare they even imagine that she could match his brilliance? He told himself it was time to put an end to the nonsense once and for all. One afternoon, as the lecture hall filled with students, the professor stood at the board, chalk in hand. But today, instead of beginning his usual routine, he paused. His eyes flicked to the back of the room where Ms. Daniels had just entered with her cart. She moved as she always did, quietly, without complaint, sweeping along the edges of the hall. The professor's lips curled into a smirk. He saw his chance. "Class," he began in a loud, commanding voice, "I've heard a rather amusing rumor going around. Some of you seem to believe that our janitor has a talent for mathematics." His tone dripped with sarcasm. A few students shifted uncomfortably. Some dared not look at Ms. Daniels, while others leaned forward, curious about what would happen. Next, the professor continued. "Well, I think it's time we clear up this little fantasy, don't you?" He turned toward the board and began scribbling a problem. But this wasn't an ordinary problem. It was one of the most advanced equations he knew, one that even graduate students struggled with. Numbers, variables, and strange symbols sprawled. across the blackboard like a foreign language. When he finished, he stepped aside, his hand sweeping dramatically toward the problem. "There it is," he said with mock cheer. "A true test of genius. And since some of you are so convinced, let's see if our janitor here can solve it." All eyes turned to Ms. Daniels. For a long moment, she didn't move. She stood, with her broom in her hands, her expression calm, though inside, her heart thudded. She hadn't expected this. She had only ever solved problems in quiet, private moments. Now the entire class was staring at her, waiting. "Come now," the professor said, his voice sharp. "Or do you admit the story is nothing but a fairy tale?" He looked pleased with himself, certain she would back down. But then, something remarkable happened. Slowly, Ms. Daniels set her broom aside. She walked to the front of the room, her footsteps steady, her face showing neither fear nor anger. She picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge, holding it carefully, as though remembering an old habit. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint scratch of the chalk as she began to write. At first, the professor folded his arms, smirking, as if the game was already won. But as the minutes passed, his smile began to fade. Her movements were confident, deliberate. She didn't hesitate, didn't stumble. Step by step, she unraveled the problem, explaining each part in a soft but clear voice that carried across the hall. The students leaned forward, stunned. They could see it, the elegance, the logic, the way everything suddenly made sense under her hand. The professor's smirk vanished completely. He frowned, his brow furrowing deeper with every line she wrote. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. She knew exactly what she was doing. Gasps filled the room as she reached the final step and placed the last number on the board. Then, she set the chalk down gently and stepped back. The solution glowed on the blackboard like a revelation. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, the students erupted. Applause, cheers, even shouts of disbelief filled the air. Some students stood up from their chairs, clapping with wide smiles. Others simply stared at Ms. Daniels as though seeing her for the first time. The professor, however, could not speak. His face burned red. He had set out to humiliate her, to destroy the rumor, but instead, she had proven it true in front of everyone. And worse, she had done it with a grace and clarity he himself often failed to show. Ms. Daniels, Daniels.com, as ever, did not bask in the applause. She simply gave a small nod, picked up her broom again, and returned to her work as if nothing unusual had happened. To her, it wasn't about showing him up. It was about doing what she loved. But the students would never forget that moment. They had witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet janitor outsmarting the arrogant professor. Not with anger, not with pride, but with undeniable brilliance. And though the professor tried to move on, tried to return to his lesson, the truth had already taken root. His authority was shaken. His arrogance, once untouchable, had been cracked wide open. The unexpected challenge had backfired, and now the entire campus knew it. Asterisk, the chalk in Ms. Daniels' hand felt light. Almost too light, as if it were nothing more than a piece of dust. But as she held it, something inside her stirred. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pride. It was something far older, a quiet love she had carried all her life, the love for numbers, for patterns, for the way mathematics could explain the universe. The room around her had gone silent. Students leaned forward on their desks, their eyes wide, some even holding their breath. Even the sound of a cough or the rustle of paper seemed out of place now. All that mattered was the woman standing in front of the blackboard, the janitor who had been mocked just minutes earlier. She placed the chalk gently against the board. At first, her movements were slow, careful. She rewrote the equation line by line, making sure the foundation was clear. Then, her pace quickened. not with nervousness, but with confidence. Her hand moved steadily, almost rhythmically, as she broke the problem into smaller steps. Each stroke of the chalk seemed to breathe life into the equation. Where the professor had scribbled hurriedly, skipping explanations to make himself seem brilliant, she wrote with clarity. She didn't just write symbols. She explained them in a calm, steady voice that carried across the hall. "This function," she said softly, "isn't meant to be forced into the wrong formula. It needs to be treated differently. You see, the professor skipped this step here." She circled part of the equation and corrected it. "If you handle it this way, it opens the path forward." Students exchanged looks of disbelief. They had never heard anyone explain something so complicated in such simple terms. For the first time, the impossible problem began to make sense. Heads nodded slowly, eyes followed every movement of her hand, and one student whispered, "She's right." The professor stood stiffly at the side of the room, arms folded, his jaw tight. At first, he had been smug, sure she would falter. But now, his smirk was gone. His eyes darted to the board, then back to her hand, then to the faces of his students. Each moment of her success was another crack in the wall of his arrogance. She continued. The chalk squeaked faintly as she wrote, filling the board with clean, logical steps. Where the professor had complicated things, she simplified. Where he had skipped, she completed. And with each line, she drew the students deeper into understanding. Finally, she reached the heart of the equation. Her hand slowed for a moment, then pressed forward with confidence. Numbers aligned, variables canceled out, and the puzzle began to unlock itself. The tension in the room grew heavier, like a storm about to break. Then came the last step. She drew the final line, underlined the answer, and placed the chalk back on the tray. For a second, no one moved. The blackboard stood before them. No longer a wall of confusion, but a masterpiece of order and elegance. She stepped back, her hands folding gently in front of her. There was no smugness in her face, no demand for applause. She simply looked at the finished solution, her eyes soft, as though seeing an old friend she had missed for many years. And then the silence broke. Gasps echoed through the hall. One student clapped hesitantly, then another, until suddenly the entire room erupted. Applause filled the space, loud and unrestrained, mixed with cheers and shouts of disbelief. Students stood from their chairs, some grinning with excitement, others shaking their heads as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The sound washed over the professor like a tidal wave. His face turned red, his hands clenched. At his sides, never in his career had he been so completely outshined and by someone he had considered beneath him. His pride screamed for him to say something, to dismiss it as luck, to reclaim his authority, but the truth was written all over the blackboard. There was no denying it. Ms. Daniels stood quietly in front of the storm of applause. She didn't bow, didn't smile, didn't even look at the professor. Instead, she bent down, picked up her broom, and returned to her work. To her, solving the equation wasn't about proving him wrong. It wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about the love of math, pure and simple. That humility made the moment even more powerful. The students weren't just cheering her solution, they were cheering her dignity, her quiet strength, and the way she had revealed genius without arrogance. The professor finally found his voice. This proves nothing," he muttered. But his words sounded weak, hollow. None of the students were listening to him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on Ms. Daniels, the janitor who had just turned their world upside down as the class ended. Groups of students crowded around each other, buzzing with excitement. "Did you see how she explained it?" One said, "It actually made sense." Another added, "She's smarter than him, way smarter." Their admiration was no longer hidden. It was open, loud, undeniable. And though Ms. Daniels left the room quietly, carrying her cleaning cart as if nothing unusual had happened, the impact of that moment would not fade. The story had now moved beyond whispers. It had become fact. The genius of the janitor had been revealed, and the arrogance of the professor would never be seen the same. Way again. The applause in the lecture hall still echoed in the professor's ears long after it had faded. He stood stiffly at the side of the classroom, his face pale and tight, his eyes darting between the blackboard and the woman with the broom. It felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. For years, he had been the unquestioned authority in this room, the voice everyone listened to. But now, all that certainty had been shaken. Cracked by the quiet hand of the janitor he had mocked, the students' reaction made it worse. They weren't even trying to hide their excitement. Some were whispering in hushed, amazed tones, pointing toward the board. Others were still smiling and shaking their heads in disbelief. A few of the braver ones even looked directly at the professor, their expressions saying what they didn't dare voice out loud. "She just outsmarted you," for the first time in his career. The professor felt powerless in his own classroom. His mind scrambled for a way to take back control, but every excuse sounded hollow, every defense fragile. The solution was right there, flawless and undeniable. He couldn't claim it was luck, and he couldn't claim it was copy he had explained every step with a clarity he himself often failed to give. He cleared his throat. "Enough of this spectacle," he said sharply, but his voice cracked in the middle, betraying him. "Class is dismissed." He turned away, pretending to gather his notes. But his hands trembled slightly, and the students noticed. They filed out slowly, some still sneaking glances at Ms. Daniels, who stood quietly at the side of the room with her broom. A few even nodded respectfully toward her as though she were not just a janitor anymore, but something far greater. When the room was nearly empty, one young student lingered. He approached her shyly, clutching his notebook to his chest. "That was amazing," he said softly. "Thank you." Ms. Daniels gave him a gentle smile. "It's nothing," she replied. "Just numbers." But the way she said it carried weight. To her, it really was just math, a language she loved, a puzzle she enjoyed. But to the student, it was a revelation. The professor overheard, and his jaw tightened. He couldn't bear the sight of his own students looking at her with admiration. It was as though his authority had been stolen, piece by piece, and given to someone he considered unworthy. That night, he sat alone in his office, staring at stacks of papers he could no longer concentrate on. His pride gnawed at him like a bitter taste he couldn't spit out. How could she, he thought. How could someone like her, someone with no degree, no title, no place in this world of academia, embarrass me in front of my own class? But beneath the anger, there was something else. A quiet voice he didn't want to hear. A voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about her. The next morning, the atmosphere in the lecture hall was different. Students entered with a buzz of energy, their conversations circling back again and again to Ms. Daniels. Some wondered where she had learned math. Others speculated about her past. A few even joked that she should be the one teaching the class instead of the professor. When the professor walked in, he felt the shift immediately. The respect that once wrapped around him like a cloak was thinner now, weaker. Their eyes followed him, but they weren't filled with admiration anymore. They were filled with curiosity, with quiet judgment. And then Ms. Daniels entered with her cart. The room went noticeably quieter. Students watched her with open interest, some smiling politely, others giving her small nods of acknowledgement. She didn't react. She simply did her job, sweeping the floor with the same quiet dignity as always. The professor gripped the edge of his desk. He couldn't take it anymore. Enough of this nonsense, he snapped suddenly, his voice louder than intended. The students froze. He glared at them, then at Ms. Daniels. She is not your professor. She is not a mathematician. She is a janitor. Remember that? The words hung heavy in the air, but they didn't land the way he intended. Instead of silencing the admiration, they sounded cruel, desperate. Several students frowned, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One girl whispered to her friend, "That's not fair." Another muttered, "But she is a mathematician." Ms. Daniels paused in her sweeping, then straightened slowly. She looked at the professor, her eyes calm, almost sorrowful. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "Respect is not given by titles. It's earned by truth." The words were soft, but they struck like thunder. The students stirred, murmurs rising, nodding in agreement. The professor felt his throat tighten. For the first time, he had no comeback. That was the turning point. The authority in the room no longer belonged to him alone. The students had seen something. He couldn't erase the truth of Ms. Daniels' brilliance, her humility, and her quiet strength. From that day forward, every time she entered the room, the atmosphere changed. There was respect in the air, a recognition that no insult could erase. The professor still gave his lectures, still filled the board with equations, but the pedestal he once stood on had cracked. He was no longer untouchable. And every time Ms. Daniels walked by, broom in hand, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing harder on his chest. He had tried to humiliate her. Instead, he had humbled himself. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the campus had ever seen. For years, Ms. Daniels had walked the same halls, pushing her cleaning cart, sweeping floors, and emptying bins. To most people, she had been invisible, just another part of the background, someone they passed without a second glance. But now, everything had changed. Students began to greet her when she entered classrooms. Some offered her warm smiles, others gave respectful nods. A few even asked her questions not about trash or cleaning supplies, but about math. "Miss Daniels," one boy said shyly, "how did you know to rearrange the function that way? I've never seen anyone explain it so clearly." She would smile, a little embarrassed, and answer in her gentle way. "Math is just like a puzzle. If you look at it the right way, the pieces fall into place." Word traveled beyond the students. Professors in other departments began hearing the stories. At first, they dismissed them as exaggerated gossip. But when students kept insisting, when they described in detail how she had solved the equation step by step, some of the faculty grew curious. A few even sat in on classes, pretending to observe the professor, but secretly hoping to catch a glimpse of Ms. Daniels' quiet brilliance. Meanwhile, the professor himself struggled. Every time he stood at the front of the class, he felt eyes on him that compared him to her. He still lectured, still filled the blackboard with formulas, but something had shifted. The authority he once held without question now felt fragile. When he spoke sharply to students, their respect no longer came automatically. Some even looked away, as if silently reminding themselves of the day the janitor had shown him up. Ms. Daniels, however, carried on as she always had. She never boasted, never claimed her place in the spotlight. She cleaned the classrooms, dusted the shelves, and swept the floors. But in the quiet moments, when she saw an equation left on the board, she couldn't help herself. She would pause, chalk in hand, and let her mind dance across the symbols. Students began leaving problems on purpose, small challenges, to see if she would solve them. And she often did, with neat handwriting and elegant steps that made even the hardest problems look simple. Before long, her reputation spread beyond the campus. A local newspaper caught wind of the story. A journalist interviewed students who described the unforgettable moment when the janitor solved what their professor could not. "She's a genius," one said firmly. "She explained it better than..." Any teacher I've ever had. The article was published under the headline, Hidden Genius, University Janitor Stuns Campus with Math Skills. Suddenly, the world outside the university began to take notice. People were amazed. How could someone who spent her days cleaning floors carry such brilliance inside her? How many other hidden geniuses, they wondered, were overlooked every day? Because of their job, their clothes, or their background? For Ms. Daniels, the attention was overwhelming. She had lived quietly for so long, never asking for recognition. She didn't care about fame or titles. All she wanted was to do her work with dignity and, when possible, indulge her love of numbers. But deep down, she felt a spark of pride, not for herself, but for the lesson her story carried. She thought of the professor often. His words still echoed in her mind. Some people should stick to mops, not math. Once, those words might have stung. But now, they had lost all their power. She had proven the truth without ever raising her voice. And though the professor rarely spoke to her, she noticed the way he avoided her eyes now, the way his tone softened. When she entered the room, it was not friendship, not even kindness. But it was respect, or at least the beginning of it. One day, as she finished sweeping after class, a group of students approached her. They held notebooks in their hands, their faces hopeful. "Miss Daniels," one girl asked, "could you, maybe, help us study for the exam?" The way you explained the problem, it just made sense. For a moment, Ms. Daniels hesitated. She wasn't a professor, wasn't even officially allowed to teach. But then she saw the sincerity in their eyes, the hunger to learn. She smiled. Softly, "All right," she said. "But I won't do the work for you. I'll just show you how to see it differently." That evening, in a quiet corner of the library, Ms. Daniels sat with a handful of students. She explained formulas with patience, breaking them down into steps that felt simple and natural. For the first time, the students didn't feel intimidated by math. They felt excited, curious, even inspired. Word spread again, this time, not about a single solved equation, but about the secret math sessions with the janitor. More students came. Soon the little study group grew, and the library corner filled with young minds eager to learn from her. The professor knew about it, of course. At first, it infuriated him. But slowly, grudgingly, he began to see what the students saw. Her talent wasn't just in solving problems. It was in teaching, in making the difficult easy, in giving others confidence. He realized that, despite all his degrees and published papers, he had never inspired students the way she did, simply by being herself. And so, the respect that had once been denied to Ms. Daniels began to grow, it, but because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Earned it through humility, through brilliance, and through quiet perseverance. Years later, students would still talk about her. They would tell new arrivals the story of the janitor who humbled the arrogant professor, the woman who showed that genius has no uniform, no title, no boundaries. Her name would be remembered not as a footnote, but as a lesson, that greatness can live in the most unexpected places. And that respect belongs not to the loudest voice, but to the truest heart. And, in the end, the campus itself changed. Students learned to look at people differently, not by their job, their clothes, or their status, but by the light within them. The day the janitor's genius was revealed became more than just a story. It became a turning point in how they understood dignity, intelligence, and humanity. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the brightest mind. And sometimes respect is not given, it is earned.